Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks, where we meet with the top thought leaders and strategists in emerging technologies, digital assets, and regulatory landscape and capital markets. I'm your host, Jill Malandrino, and joining me on the desk at the Nasdaq market site is Tony Asio, Head of Regulatory Strategy and Innovation at Nasdaq. We have Eun Ah Choi, Global Head of Regulatory Operations at Nasdaq, as well as Rich Shulman, Vice President of Surveillance Optimization and Innovation at FINRA. We're here to discuss the evolving surveillance and compliance landscape and how firms are leveraging advances in technology to gain a strategic edge in an increasingly complex and dynamic environment. It is great to have all of you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks. Tony, let's start with you quickly. Give us background in terms of your role at Nasdaq.
So I work for Nasdaq's FinTech division. I engage with regulators, mostly around things like emerging technologies, and I also look after the Nasdaq market surveillance product.
Yeah, and Una, it's interesting, you know, a global head of regulatory operations, you're thinking of multiple jurisdictions day to day.
Indeed, I manage our regulatory operations in US and in Europe, and that includes listing qualifications and trading surveillance as well.
All right, and Rich, round it out with FINRA.
Sure, so I work at FINRA, the industry's self-regulatory organization. I work within the market regulation department there as part of our surveillance team, looking to both optimize and innovate the surveillance program that FINRA has.
Yeah, and we look forward to getting more insight in terms of how emerging technologies are helping that role to evolve. Tony, I want to talk about the scope of the 2024 Nasdaq Global Compliance Survey. What was it targeting?
So every year we run the Global Compliance Survey. It's a survey that's out for buy-side, sell-side, market infrastructure firms, and really the goal is to find out what is the current landscape around compliance right now. So for last year when we did the survey, we saw a couple of interesting findings. I think the most interesting finding and the biggest shift from the year prior was its kind of the priorities. So we asked people, what is the biggest driver for compliance change? So last year they said the biggest driver of compliance change is emerging technology, right? So compared to previous years where it was really about regulatory scrutiny, right? So 35% of respondents said emerging technology. And on the same vein, we also asked them about their hiring decisions, right? And it was really quite interesting. So if you looked at it from previous years, people were really kind of focusing upon senior compliance professionals, and that's really what the focus was. But going for the next 12 months, what people are saying is they're looking at hiring data scientists, IT or tech roles, and kind of goes into what they said earlier about the biggest driver being emerging technologies. And then lastly, and I would say this is in terms of kind of what might be kind of interesting and related to what I just said, we asked them what are the biggest challenges they think they're focusing, kind of really from a compliance, market integrity perspective, and they kind of mentioned a few things. I think cross-market capabilities, some kind of more complex financial frauds. They were talking about potential capacity issues, right, being a major concern. And then kind of like finally one of the big concerns was around false positives and reducing false positives. And that was kind of one of the top concerns. And it's interesting because technology is a potential kind of resolution to some of the concerns that they had.
Yeah, I do think that is interesting. Una, from your perspective, what role do you see technology playing in shaping compliance strategies?
Absolutely critical ingredient to our success. And first, it's because technology is evolving so quickly. If you don't keep up real time, you'll be left behind. And second is that there are so many complex regulatory requirements now that you cannot do this with manpower alone. You have to have the skills and the tools to be able to sort of sift through all the different complexities and make sure that you're following the right sets of regulations and following them across the globe. So it's not just one jurisdiction versus the other. And then third, which I think is really an important point, is that not only are the data sets growing exponentially, so trading data, trading alerts, also the sources of data are exponentially growing. So you have financial transactions information, you have regulatory reporting, you have social media, you have news, and you have other sources that didn't exist before. So you need technology to be able to kind of curate the information that you need to do your job, whether it's in compliance or surveillance. And just recently we actually developed a Gen AI tool in order to do exactly that, to go out there, gather the data that our analysts need through a variety of different sources so that they can do in few minutes what used to take few hours.
Yeah, and that's a point that I noticed you picked up as well in terms of one of the key findings is understanding and implementing technology capabilities. We talk about financial literacy, but AI literacy is a big part of it, not just for the tech teams and senior management making these decisions to deploy them.
Exactly.
Everybody needs to understand how this works.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that self-education for those of us who are already in the industry is a key thing. And of course, hiring the right people with that skill set is another key ingredient for success.
Yeah, and Richard, from your perspective, what role does technology play in shaping compliance strategies, whether specific to FINRA or the industry overall?
Yeah, echoing what I think both Tony and Eun Ah were saying, it's incredibly important. When you think about, Tony, the two of the problems, the big data piece and the false positives, those are problems or use cases that emerging technology are particularly suited to be able to solve. On the cloud perspective, being able to have that variable computing element to it, where you're not always just bringing the full power all the time, but having them scale up and be able to scale up based off the size of the data is huge. And machine learning, AI, and the like are so powerful for false positives, as opposed to thinking it needs to be very binary, like bigger than this, less than that, bigger than this. Like AI starts to be able to introduce that element of variability and kind of scoring things to be allowing people to configure what they want to see versus what they don't want to see more dynamically.
Let's get a little bit of background on false positives. Is that almost a way of saying bias in another way, in the context of surveillance and compliance? What's the challenge with false positives?
Well, I think whenever you're designing a surveillance, you're trying to find that right balance between picking up and covering the risk you need to cover versus not wanting to let too much noise in. It's a balancing act, because if you go too tight, you could be missing things and end up having false negatives as opposed to false positives, meaning that these are examples that you should have caught that you didn't. And you want to be removing or mitigating that risk, so you have to try and find that balance between pulling in as much as you want to see and removing as much as you don't want to see.
Yeah, I mean, that can evolve into a pretty big problem if you miss something because of the data input and output. Tony, it's interesting, you brought up demographic trends in terms of staffing and skill sets as well as investment priorities, and that's one thing I picked up off as the survey as well. Where do you see firms investing heavily as it relates to the technologies?
I would say, and kind of Richard kind of mentioned it, I think cloud is one of the key aspects that people are moving towards, and capacity was one of the key kind of issues that people have raised, right? I think cloud also enables the use of kind of other types of technologies. So for example, the Gen AI use case that Eun Ah mentioned, that was built on top of cloud capabilities for us to kind of collate that type of information together, right? Obviously, I think the big kind of question is around AI. Right, and I think everyone is kind of looking at AI and AI capabilities now. I think this is kind of a major thing that kind of regulators, kind of compliance teams, everyone is looking at that now, and then both from kind of two perspectives, right? One perspective is how, from we as compliance department, able to leverage AI and kind of solve some of these complex problems that we talked about. And then the second thing is that the markets are changing. So Nasdaq itself, we introduced an AI order type last year, and the order type is the fundamental building block of the marketplace, right? So the fundamental building block of the marketplace now incorporates artificial intelligence, right? So irrespective of if you are going to leverage AI, AI is going to impact you anyway, and you need to be prepared, and people are looking at staffing to be able to kind of handle that.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting too, the shift towards hybrid approaches to surveillance. The survey said 52.1% of respondents are investing in a combination of third-party and in-house technology, which is interesting because we're hearing this in other industries as well, where that migration to cloud, 5 years ago, let's call it pre-COVID, it was such a big priority, and we're seeing that hybrid pendulum come back to the middle where there is on-prem and cloud, and that 52% is nearly, half and half.
Yeah, and I would say it's kind of do this. I would say it's because the complexity of the challenge has increased, right? So the expectation amongst regulators is kind of higher, and the complexity has increased because technology, and it kind of comes back to technology. Technology has made trading so much easier, but it's also made it kind of easier to do more complex forms of market abuse, right? What that means for kind of like compliance teams is that the expectations are high. They did look at kind of more complex types of behaviors that might be across multiple markets, multiple different types of instruments, and things like that. So having this kind of hybrid approach allows some of these firms to experiment internally, right, but still be able to take the best of breed in terms of what's possible out there right now.
Yeah, so Eun Ah, it sounds like complex investigations and reporting capabilities are also becoming more complex. To your point earlier, across multiple jurisdictions, I would imagine that the integration of these tools, that's really the catalyst behind it.
It really is, and I think it's also people in addition to the tools as well. So, we are hiring more data scientists and technologists to be embedded within our programs to be able to do just that. And the benefit of that is, sometimes the technology teams and the end users do not always speak the same language. And as we all know, technological projects and programs are really integral part of making sure that our products and our programs are efficient and effective. So having that expertise and skill set in-house helps us to not only facilitate and do the everyday better, but helps us to kind of come up with a product that's tailored and in a more efficient way. Yeah. So that's all kind of embedded into sort of how we think about our strategy in terms of being better, faster, and more effective, is that using the right tools, but also having the right people in-house to kind of speak the same language with the external sort of providers.
Yeah, and Richard, it's so interesting, we were talking about this off camera as well, being able to communicate from that surveillance, cyber, data governance perspective to the different audiences in terms of how you're trying to resource and get allocation to be able to invest in these properties. So I think that area of the business is making its case better in terms of why it's so important to the business.
Yeah, absolutely. And building off that same language point, I really think we're seeing that as well, both in terms of FINRA as well as what firms are doing. The importance of having people in the business who have those technical skills, who aren't scared of data, can work with it, are fluent in it. We're not saying in all cases, that everyone needs to be the most full-blown data scientist, but being able to combine business knowledge with technical skills is so important. It's something right now at FINRA we're working on upskilling people, which is that term means there is like taking people who know the business side of things, but then starting to give them more exposure to things from like a database perspective in terms of like how to work with it in code and at scale, and trying to find that right marriage of technical expertise, business expertise, and to try and push towards that common.
Yeah, and Tony, I think that's exciting because sometimes we hear through this lens of AI is going to take jobs or it's going to eliminate certain areas of the business. I think what's interesting with compliance is you don't necessarily have to be a comp sci major or be a data analyst. There's so many, compliance is needed in every sector, every firm, that there is more opportunity than you might necessarily think when you're just looking through the lens of tech.
Yeah, and I'll say this as well, and it's I'll kind of reiterate something I said earlier, which is that the challenge has become bigger, right? The expectation from regulators and the possible potential things that need to be looked at, it's the actual issues. The compliance burden has grown, right? So even if say, for example, AI makes your job 50% more efficient, you may have 200% more things to do, right? So that's the kind of challenge we're facing, right? And so now it's become almost requirement for people to use these new types of emerging technologies. And this is something that we did ourselves. So we looked at emerging technologies such as AI and said, and rather than saying, is this the catch-all, we looked at the whole workflow of what a compliance analyst does, right? And there's potential opportunities in each aspect of that workflow, from data ingest, around cleansing data, all the way to summarization and creation reports that you could send to the regulator, right? So each of those steps will have different tools or processes that need to be improved. And this is why we've got this big look at emerging technologies and this big look at hiring around these data scientists, because it's not just one big bang holistic thing that's going to come in. There's actually lots of little use cases that could be improved by these new emerging technologies.
Yeah. Una, how do you view this through the lens of having to manage multiple jurisdictions and determining what the best path of governance is?
Sure. I think it's really being thoughtful and deliberate about the choices that you make, and also understanding what the opportunity costs of those choices are, so that you know that you're trying to make sure that you stage your decision points in a really meaningful way and across jurisdictions as well. So that's one way to think about it in terms of having a cohesive strategy. I think the second part is also just, we're all under budget constraints. I know a survey says that there has been an increase in terms of the overall spending on technology, but we all live in a budget constrained environment. So the real challenge, but the real step that we always think about is what is the low-hanging fruit and what is the near-term must-have, without losing sort of attention to the long-term capabilities. So, one of the things that we've really focused on is efficiency, right? False positive reduction, or make the analysts be able to analyze faster. But I think as we move forward into the future, it's going to be more about bad actor detection and prevention.
Yeah, it's so interesting because sometimes when you talk about these technology investments, the first thing that comes to mind is ROI, right?
Yes.
And I feel as if businesses are looking at that through a different lens,
Right.
where what's our risk tolerance?
Yeah.
Thinking about risk mitigation first,
Yeah.
and with that, cyber/privacy first strategy, and by design. So you're also hearing how ROI is shifting.
Yes, absolutely. And just compliance itself is not enough. As the survey says, part of what we're focused on is brand reputational risk and things of that nature. And that means trying to make sure that those things that occur that shouldn't occur are prevented. And so that's, I think, as we think about technology and sort of steps for the future, that's how I think we're going to be starting to invest a lot more as we move forward.
And Rich, when you think about it, we're in one of the most heavily regulated industries. So when you look forward, challenges and opportunities, how do you stay ahead of that technology curve? What is your outlook?
Yeah, I mean, for me, so much as what everyone's been saying comes down to the use cases, the problems you're looking to solve, those will continue to evolve. But when we think about where AI or more emerging tech is useful, I think making sure that you're thinking about is this the right fit for it? Because not every solution needs it. But then also starting to get that feedback in terms of where it works well, where maybe things need to evolve and continue to grow. That to me is going to be a give and take kind of iterative feedback loop as we kind of grow our own knowledge with the technology and kind of continue to find the right combination.
Yeah, and Tony, that's such a great point that he makes, and we have this in every AI conversation. Don't look for problems to solve that don't exist.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, you want to be able to justify, the cost of the investment and see a verifiable outcome.
And that's why we took that very targeted approach, right?
Yeah.
It's where we basically say, look at this workflow, and the low-hanging fruits is kind of a great example, right? Because with these kind of new technical capabilities, right? There's a kind of almost a lot of people just want to apply it to everything, but not everything's going to apply to everything, right? And I want to go back to Richard's comment about and your comment about the regulated industry and regulated environment. We work in probably one of the most highly regulated industries in the world, right? So say we're applying new technologies, be that cloud or AI, right? We need to kind of also ensure that they meet the requirements around resiliency, transparency, kind of robustness, kind of cybersecurity, all these points you said. And that's kind of the core, right? So it's quite different than kind of some of these other companies that might be building kind of apps to make you select your better hamburger choice. Right, we need to make quite different kind of decisions around our investments. And when we design kind of products that use these emerging technologies, we really need to take that regulation, the industry standpoint in mind from the point we start building these products.
Yeah, and Una, to wrap up here, Tony, if I could virtually high-five you across the table. That's such a great point, because there are pain points when it comes to being in a heavily regulated space like financial services. However, frameworks do exist as it relates to privacy law, governance, and so forth. So we do have a framework in terms of understanding the operating environment. So it doesn't hinder innovation as much as you think it would.
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, sometimes having that framework allows us to think freely, right? Because you know what the guardrails are, or you know what the parameters are. So I think you can be really creative within that construct. And, I think that's what we're trying to do, because compliance, surveillance, all of this is a business strategy choice, right, in terms of what we do and how we do it. It's not a checklist, and so there's a lot of thought and creativity and innovation that can be really implemented into, sort of our day-to-day work.
Yeah. Well, at the end of the day, without compliance, we can't function as firms.
Exactly.
So we wouldn't be sitting around the table today. Appreciate everyone's insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.